All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Because today we're going to be talking about the courage to be disliked. Now, this isn't your typical self-help book. It's more like, having a late-night conversation with a philosopher who's about to, totally challenge everything you thought you knew about happiness and freedom.
It's actually written as a dialogue between this skeptical young man and this philosopher who very calmly dismantles his whole worldview. And it's all through the lens of Alfred Adler's psychology, which is pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and Adler, he's not as famous as Freud or anything, but he had some really, radical ideas.
For sure.
Like, one of the things that really hit me was this whole idea of teleology, which is the idea that we're actually driven by our future goals, not chained to our past.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but I know I spend way too much time thinking about the past and even using it as an excuse for why I can't do things today.
Oh, totally. The book has this great analogy about a well full of water, right? So the water in the well stays at a constant 60 degrees, right? Objectively, the temperature is always the same.
Right, yeah.
But in the summer, that water feels refreshingly cool, But then in the winter, that same 60-degree water feels surprisingly warm. So it's our interpretation, our goal at that moment, are we trying to cool off or warm up? And that's what changes our perception of it.
That's so true. So I guess the question is, are you stuck in this cycle of blaming your past for your current unhappiness? Maybe, just maybe, if you could shift your focus to what you want to achieve in the future, that could unlock a whole new level of freedom and possibility.
Definitely. Now, the young man in the book, he's totally stuck in this idea of etiology, the belief that past traumas just dictate our present. He keeps throwing all these examples at the philosopher, trying to prove that past events are what shape people's lives.
Yeah.
But the philosopher doesn't budge an inch.
He doesn't. He's
Okay.
rock solid in his beliefs.
Oh, yeah. He even goes so far as to say that even if your friend thinks he can't fit in because of past abuse, it's because he's chosen to think that way.
Oof, that's a tough pill to swallow, right?
It is, and it's kind of where Adlerian psychology gets really interesting, because
Yeah.
the idea is that, we often cling to what the book calls life lies. Using our past experiences as these excuses to just stay stuck.
So what are your life lies? What excuses are you holding on to that are preventing you from, going after what you want?
Right, exactly. The book gives this example of a shut-in, someone who chooses to totally isolate themselves from the world.
Yeah.
And they might claim it's because of social anxiety that stems from some past event or whatever.
Right, yeah.
But Adler would argue that their whole goal might be something else entirely. Maybe it's to control their parents' reactions or avoid all the challenges of actually engaging with the world.
It's interesting because this whole idea of life lies, it has this weird flip side too. We can even dislike ourselves as a strategy.
Yeah.
And the young man in the book, he insists that he dislikes himself. And he can't see any goal in that.
Right, but the philosopher challenges him on that. He's suggesting that those feelings of inferiority are often just subjective, It's all about interpretation. And he uses his own height as an example. He was shorter than average, and he felt like that really held him back. But objectively, his height wasn't inferior.
Right.
It was just his interpretation of it that created all those yucky feelings.
So what about you? What are the things that you dislike about yourself? Are they actually flaws, or are you just choosing to see them that way? Maybe this disliking, it's actually serving some hidden purpose, giving you an excuse to avoid certain, situations or challenges.
It's totally possible. We all have things we want to change about ourselves.
Yeah.
But often those feelings of inferiority, they're just excuses disguised as, if only I was X, then I could do Y.
It's the classic procrastination trap.
Oh, sure.
And then you have the flip side of that, which the book calls the superiority complex.
Right, where people are boasting and acting all arrogant, but it's really just a mask for their deep insecurity.
Yeah, it's overcompensating for those feelings of inferiority by trying to, appear better than everyone else.
Totally.
So are you using your, perceived flaws as an excuse to stay small? Or are you masking your insecurities with this, show of superiority?
Yeah, it's something to think about.
I think Adler would say that the key to, real growth is acknowledging those feelings of inferiority, but not letting them define you.
Definitely.
Okay, get ready for this next part, because this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The philosopher just drops this bombshell. He argues that all problems are ultimately interpersonal relationship problems.
Wow.
And then He introduces this concept called the separation of tasks.
Interesting.
Naturally, the young man, he's like, wait a minute, what about shut-ins? Isn't there isolation caused by external factors, other people's actions?
Right.
But the philosopher, he insists that their response to those external factors is still their own choice. So parents can offer support, friends can reach out, but ultimately it's up to the individual to choose to engage with the world.
So it's like, even if something bad happens to you, how you respond to that, that's still on you.
Exactly. The book uses the example of having a terrible boss. Like, whose task is it to manage that boss's emotions?
Right.
Yours is to do your work ethically and professionally, not to take on the burden of their negativity.
Oh, that's good.
So where are you carrying burdens that aren't yours to bear? Are you taking on responsibility for, like, other people's emotions or their problems?
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to draw some boundaries and focus on what you can control, like your own actions and reactions.
Good point. And this kind of leads to this whole discussion about, the desire for recognition.
Yeah.
And, like, the young man in the book, he argues that parents can't just tell their kids, do whatever you want. They have this responsibility to guide them, to discipline them.
Right.
And that's where the philosopher just throws down the gauntlet. He says, we must not live to satisfy other people's expectations.
Oh, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Are you seeking approval at the cost of, like, your true self?
Yeah.
Are you twisting yourself into knots, trying to meet expectations that don't even align with your own values or your goals?
That's deep.
It is. And the book, it uses this example of a child's education. So, like, the child's task is to study,
Right.
to put in the effort to learn. The parent's task is to provide the right environment for that. The books, the support, the encouragement. But ultimately, that outcome, that's the child's responsibility.
That makes sense.
Okay, this is one of the most powerful ideas in the whole book, and maybe one of the most controversial.
Okay, what is it?
The idea that not being afraid of being disliked is the key to freedom in relationships.
Wow.
So before you, picture yourself storming into work tomorrow and telling everyone exactly what you really think. Remember, this isn't about being a jerk.
Right.
It's about living authentically, expressing your true self, even if it means that not everyone is going to like it.
That's easier said than done, though.
Oh, absolutely. But the philosopher, he actually shares a personal story here about his own difficult relationship with his father and how this idea of the separation of tasks actually helped him mend it.
Interesting.
He chose to engage with his father from a place of respect and understanding, but he didn't allow his father's negativity to control his own emotions or his behavior.
That's a good example. Okay, so where does this all lead?
Well, it brings us to maybe the most mind-bending concept in the whole book, this idea of community feeling.
Yeah.
And it goes way beyond just belonging to a particular group, like your family or your workplace. It's about feeling connected to something so much larger than yourself, to humanity, to the world, even to the universe.
It's like a sense of belonging that transcends any specific group or place, right?
Exactly. It's like recognizing the interconnectedness of all things.
I like that.
The book gives this amazing example. Talks about buying a loaf of bread.
Oh, okay.
And, most of us, we just see that as a simple transaction. But the philosopher, he says, try to become aware of everyone who is involved in that process.
Oh, wow.
The farmer who grew the wheat, the miller who ground it into flour, the baker who, kneaded the dough and baked the bread.
Yeah.
The truck driver who delivered it to the store.
It really makes you think about all the people behind the things we take for granted, huh?
Totally. It expands our sense of belonging beyond just ourselves and the people we interact with directly. And it reminds us that we're all part of this much bigger picture, that our actions have ripple effects, and that even seemingly small things can contribute to the greater good.
That's really powerful. But I can see how the young man would struggle with this.
Oh yeah, he does. He's like, wouldn't a smaller community be more impactful? Like a place where you can actually see the direct results of your actions.
That makes sense, like a tight-knit group of friends or a small town or something.
Yeah, exactly. But the philosopher, he counters that. He says, when things go wrong in those smaller communities, like a falling out with a friend or a toxic work environment, it can be devastating.
Right, because your whole world feels like it's falling apart.
Exactly, like your sense of belonging is just shattered. But having a broader sense of connection, that provides resilience.
It's interesting.
You realize that your worth isn't dependent on the approval or acceptance of any one person or group.
So it's like you have this safety net.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what the book takes us to next, this idea that happiness is contribution.
It's not about self-sacrifice or anything, or like giving until you're completely depleted, True contribution, the way Adler sees it, it comes from a sense of belonging, like from understanding that your very existence has value and that you have something like unique to offer the world.
It's like that aha moment the young man has, towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
When he realizes that even these like seemingly insignificant actions can ripple outwards and impact the world in ways that we can't even imagine.
Right.
Like he uses the example of buying a loaf of bread. Right. And, it seems so simple, but when you really think about it, that one act, it connects you to the baker, the farmer, the miller, like this whole network of people working together.
It's like such a perfect example of how our lives are all interwoven and how even our everyday actions can contribute to something so much bigger than ourselves.
Totally. And I think that's where this idea of community feeling really comes to life.
Yeah.
It's not about needing to be the center of attention or constantly seeking validation from others. It's about recognizing that we're all part of this much larger story, something that gives our lives meaning and purpose.
Exactly. But the young man, he still kind of pushes back on this.
He does, yeah.
He's like, well, if happiness is just about feeling like you contribute, then wouldn't everyone be happy? I mean, we all contribute in some way, right?
That's a good question.
It is, and it really highlights this crucial distinction that the philosopher makes. He points out that a lot of people, they seek happiness through what he calls the desire for recognition. Okay. So they want to be praised, admired, they want to feel special and stand out from the crowd.
So their happiness becomes totally dependent on external validation.
Exactly. They're always chasing approval, trying to meet other people's expectations, instead of listening to their own inner compass.
And that can be so exhausting.
Right.
Right. Always trying to please everyone else.
Totally. It's a recipe for burnout, for sure. The book suggests that true happiness, it comes from this internal sense of contribution.
So it's not about what other people think of you. It's about knowing in your own heart that you're living in alignment with your values, that you're making a positive impact in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to you.
Exactly.
And that contribution, as we've been talking about, doesn't have to be this huge, grandiose thing.
Right.
It can be as simple as, helping out a colleague who's struggling, or lending a listening ear to a friend who needs to vent, or, volunteering your time to a cause that you believe in, or even just showing up to your job with integrity and care.
It's about those small, everyday acts of kindness and contribution that when you weave them all together, they create this beautiful tapestry of a meaningful life.
The book also talks about problem behavior, particularly in children. And this can be a really tough topic. But the philosopher, he suggests that these behaviors acting out or rebelling or withdrawing, they're often attempts to gain a sense of control or a sense of superiority, even if it's through negative attention.
So it's they're trying to get a reaction.
Exactly. The book gives the example of a child who disrupts the classroom.
Okay.
He's not necessarily trying to be bad. He's just trying to get a reaction, to exert some influence over his environment, even if it's in this disruptive way.
And instead of responding with punishment or scolding, which can often make the problem worse, the book suggests a totally different approach.
What's that?
One that's based on encouragement and understanding.
I like that.
It's about helping the child, find more constructive ways to meet their needs and to feel a sense of belonging within the group.
So not just focusing on controlling their behavior.
Right, but helping them understand why they're acting that way and giving them tools to express themselves in healthier ways.
This kind of brings us back to that whole idea of horizontal relationships.
Yeah.
Which the book contrasts with vertical relationships. So vertical relationships are all about hierarchy.
Okay.
The traditional dynamic between, a boss and an employee, or a parent and a child.
Right.
Where one person is seen as having more power or authority than the other. But horizontal relationships, they're based on equality and mutual respect. Recognizing that each individual has inherent worth and a unique contribution to make.
It's about shifting away from this power struggle and creating a more collaborative and respectful dynamic.
Exactly. And instead of using praise or rebuke, which the book sees as forms of manipulation that are aimed at controlling behavior, it advocates for a different approach.
Now what's that?
Encouragement. In encouragement, it focuses on empowering others to find their own solutions. It's about recognizing their efforts and their progress.
So not just judging the outcome.
Right, but focusing on the process. Like, did they try their best? Did they learn something new?
It's about fostering a sense of autonomy and self-efficacy.
Yeah.
Allowing individuals to, explore their capabilities, to make their own choices, and to learn from their mistakes along the way.
Now, I know this might sound like a really, radical shift.
It does.
Especially for those who are, used to more traditional hierarchical ways of relating to others.
But imagine, what would be possible if we could approach all of our interactions with this spirit of equality and mutual respect?
Yeah.
Recognizing the inherent worth and potential in every single person we encounter.
It's a beautiful vision. And it all starts with, shifting our perspective.
It does. It's about, recognizing that everyone has something valuable to contribute.
And remembering that we're all on this journey together.
Exactly. We're all in this together.
Okay, so welcome back. Before we wrap up our deep dive into the courage to be disliked, I want to go back to this idea that happiness is the feeling of contribution. It's something we touched on earlier, but it's so central to the whole book.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that the book makes this really clear distinction between contribution and self-sacrifice, you know? It's not about neglecting your own needs or constantly putting everyone else first.
Right.
True contribution, according to Adler, it comes from this sense of belonging, this understanding that your existence, just by existing, you have value, and that you have something unique to offer the world.
It's like that moment the young man has toward the end of the book, like that aha moment.
Oh, yeah.
When he finally realizes that even these seemingly insignificant actions can have this ripple effect, impacting the world in ways we can't even imagine.
Right.
He uses the example of buying a loaf of bread. It seems so simple, but when you really think about it, that one act connects you to the baker, the farmer, the miller. This whole web of people who are all working together.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful illustration of how our lives are all interconnected.
Totally.
And how even our everyday actions can contribute to something so much bigger than ourselves.
And that's, I think, where this whole idea of community feeling really comes alive. It's not about being the center of attention or needing constant validation from other people. It's about understanding that we're all part of this larger story. There's something that gives our lives meaning and purpose.
Exactly. But, the young man, he still has a hard time with this.
Oh, yeah, he does.
He asks, well, if happiness is just about feeling like you contribute, shouldn't everyone be happy? I mean, we all contribute in some way, right?
That's a good question. And it highlights this really crucial distinction that the philosopher makes. He says that a lot of people seek happiness through what he calls the desire for recognition.
It's like they need to be seen, to be acknowledged.
Right. So they want to be praised, admired. They want to feel special, to stand out from the crowd. But the philosopher says that's a trap.
Because then your happiness becomes totally dependent on what other people think of you.
Exactly. You're always chasing approval, trying to meet other people's expectations instead of following your own inner compass.
Yeah.
Which can be so exhausting. And the book, it suggests that true happiness, it comes from this internal sense of contribution. So it's not about what other people think of you. It's about knowing in your own heart that you're living in alignment with your own values, that you're making a positive impact in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to you.
And that contribution, like we've been saying, it doesn't have to be this huge, world-changing thing. It can be those small, everyday things, like helping a colleague who's struggling, or lending a listening ear to a friend who needs to vent, or volunteering your time to a cause you believe in, even just showing up to work with integrity and care. It's those little things that when you add them all up, they really do make a difference.
Like those little acts of kindness and generosity, they create a ripple effect. They spread outwards, touching more people than we can even imagine.
Exactly. And the book, it also talks about this topic that can be kind of tough to talk about.
What's that?
Problem behavior, particularly in children.
Okay.
And the philosopher, he has this interesting take on it. He suggests that a lot of these behaviors, like acting out or rebelling or even withdrawing, they're often attempts to gain a sense of control, or a sense of superiority, even if it's through negative attention. It's like they're trying to get a reaction, to exert some influence over their environment, even if it's in a disruptive way.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, pay attention to me.
Right. And instead of just coming down hard on them with punishment or scolding, which, let's face it, it often just makes the problem worse, the book offers a different approach.
Okay, I'm curious. What is it?
It's about approaching the situation with encouragement and understanding. you know, helping the child find more constructive ways to get their needs met and feel a sense of belonging within the group.
So not just focusing on controlling their behavior.
Right, but helping them understand, like, the root of the behavior, why they're acting out in the first place, and giving them the tools to express themselves in a way that's, you know, healthier for everyone involved.
I like that. And this kind of brings us back to that whole idea of horizontal relationships, you know, which the book contrasts with vertical relationships. Vertical relationships are all about hierarchy, right? Like the classic dynamic between a boss and an employee, or a parent and a child, where one person is seen as like having more power or authority than the other.
Yeah, it creates this like power imbalance.
Exactly. But horizontal relationships, they're based on equality and mutual respect, recognizing that everyone has something valuable to offer, regardless of their position or their age.
Yeah, it's about shifting away from this like power struggle and creating a dynamic that's more collaborative and respectful.
Exactly. And instead of using praise or rebuke, which the book sees as forms of manipulation, you know, aimed at controlling behavior, it advocates for a different approach. Encouragement. Encouragement, it focuses on empowering people to find their own solutions, to recognize their efforts and progress, not just judging them based on the outcome.
Yeah, it's about focusing on the process.
Exactly. Did they try their best? Did they learn something new? That's what really matters. And I know this might sound like a really radical shift, especially for people who are, you know, used to those more traditional hierarchical ways of doing things. But just imagine what would be possible if we could approach all of our interactions, you know, with this spirit of equality and mutual respect. If we could see the inherent worth and potential in every single person we meet. It's a beautiful vision, and it all starts with, you know, just shifting our perspective, recognizing that we're all in this together, and that everyone has something valuable to offer. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the courage to be disliked, I think one of the most important takeaways for me is that happiness, it's a choice. It's not something that just happens to us. It's something that we have to cultivate through our actions, our perspectives, our relationship.
It's not always easy.
Yeah.
You know, it takes courage to let go of that need for constant approval, to embrace our imperfections, to focus on contributing to the world in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to us.
But the courage to be disliked, it reminds us that we have the power to choose our path. We can choose to live in fear and self-doubt, or we can choose to embrace the freedom that comes with radical self-acceptance and unconditional love for others. So that's it for our deep dive into the courage to be disliked. We hope you found this exploration insightful and, you know, maybe even a little bit challenging. But remember, as the philosopher says, those who hear this can be happy now. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.